Every generation thinks the next musical tool is cheating until it becomes part of the creative language. At least that's what I'm going to try and unpick in this video. Where are your red lines? Where do you draw the line between cheating and creativity? And a little technical help goes back further than you might think. It's not all about electronics. This is Irving Berlin, one of the great American songwriters. He wrote White Christmas and There's No Business Like Show Business, as well as about 1,000 other classic tracks. But is this cheating?
Well, you see, I only play an F sharp in the black key, you see?
Oh, the black key.
That's right.
The keyboard moves so he doesn't have to learn to play in anything other than F sharp major, all black keys. So it's a little mechanical, technical leg up. But I wonder what he'd make of all our modern cheat codes. A couple of weeks ago I made this video showing how AI wasn't quite up to the mark as far as producing really believable, honest tracks is concerned. And the mere mention of AI sent some people into blind fits of rage, which is understandable, although I'm not quite sure how talking about it, especially showing its flaws, led some people to imagine me vigorously pleasuring myself. But interestingly, in the comments, others did question where the line is drawn between something being creative and something that's basically cheating. And I'm not really trying to answer anything here, I'm just asking the questions, looking through the history of music tech and how it's developed. And at each stage, there's been accusations of people not being proper musicians. Proper musicians wouldn't use drum machines, that's cheating. Proper musicians wouldn't use synthesizers, that's cheating. Proper musicians wouldn't use sequencers, that's cheating. And when samplers were first used, that was definitely cheating. And I can even remember when it was considered cheating not recording a whole song in one take. If you asked anyone's dad back in the 1980s about bands like Duran Duran, they were considered not real musicians. They were cheating because they were recording track after track and they weren't playing it all live. And then we look back now and they're really unique, characterful tracks by great musicians who did play live. So the boundaries seem to always be changing.
Thou best listen to me, son. That's not music. That's an abomination. They're not playing all the instruments all at the same time.
And that line really does blur over time. Does anyone really consider using a drum machine cheating these days? You know, Phil Collins back in the 80s used a drum machine and he was a reasonably good drummer. You look at sequencers, would anyone think of sequencers as cheating now, or just part of the musical sort of framework, the landscape of how you create tracks? Queen, for instance, famously proclaimed that the band did not use synthesizers. But apparently that wasn't all about them hating synths, or had they changed the lines? Roger Taylor did say it was more about Brian May was using his guitar so well, people assumed they were using synths and they just wanted to say, no, Brian's that good, he can use his guitar and effects to do these things. Or, as I say, is that a little bit of a retrospective relook at why they were saying that? Because when it came to 1982 and their Hot Spice album, they were using an Oberheim OBX, an Oberheim OBXA, a Roland Jupiter 8, a Roland VP330, and the LM1 drum machine. Interestingly, 2 years later in 1984, Freddie Mercury recorded Love Kills with Giorgio Moroder, which was a drum machine, synth and sequencer track. So I guess he was over any synth hate by then. And ironically, it was for a re-release of Metropolis, a 1927 film about a dystopian future where the machines feed off humans. Does that sound familiar? More about that later. Creating a string sound on a synth isn't really now considered cheating, is it? A string synth is a thing in its own right. No one was complaining when Vangelis, back in 1982 even, used synthesizers for strings and for brass. No one thought he was taking jobs from brass sections or string players or percussionists, but they have been accusations for synthesizers in the past. So as I say, the lines do blur, or the boundaries blur, as we move through time. So where are they now? And there's this great article by Don Snowden from The Guardian in 2012, released on Bob Moog's birthday when there was this Moog Google Doodle, which is quite cool. I'll stick a link in the description. You can do little 4-track recordings with it. And that article is all about how synths became part of the musical lexicon. It might seem crackers now, but your grandparents or your parents might really have thought using a synthesizer was cheating and taking jobs off other people. But I think these days, I don't think anyone will think it was cheating, would they? And what about samples? These days you can simply go onto a service like Splice, download a drum loop, a bass line, a chord progression, just add a bunch of loops into Ableton and bingo, there's a track. Here I've got a bass line, a couple of top lines, a kick drum, a nice little house piano and a couple of little vocal samples, and it sounds okay. 20 minutes. And it seems crazy, but that's my track now. That's a copyrightable, protectable track. I didn't write any of the bits. The people that wrote the bits get paid for those bits. I've taken those bits and I've made something else, but that is a track. And as I say, it sounds crazy, but there'll be plenty of things that you've heard, that you've danced to, that have been on the radio, that are using lots of little snippets out of things like this. Sample CDs have been around for decades. Who remembers things like the 0G data files? Thousands of samples, none of them cleared, and all sorts of copyright issues. The samples were used all over the place. And I can't help but feel that using things like Splice and just adding sample after sample is cheating. For me, that's my red line. Other people, they think that's fine, and maybe it is fine, I don't know. Everybody has their own individual place they'll go. I feel it's cheating. I feel I've not put enough creative input into it. If I created that into a full 5-minute dance track, I would have a lot more input into it, obviously. And maybe by that time, I would really be invested in it and feel I could put enough in it to feel like it's my track. But as it stands at the minute, those 5 or 6 parts put together like that, that's a track, and that's fine. I know I'm sort of having a go at it, but if anyone does want to license it, I'm all ears. And making tracks like that reminds me of my mates who had a record label in Liverpool back in the early 90s as dance music was taking off. And they get thousands of demo tapes in, and they would select the best ones, release them. They were basically curators. So I feel a little bit like on things like Splice and other ones that are available, that you are like a curator. You take the bits that you think are best, stick them together. You know, it's not necessarily very musical, not necessarily extremely creative, but it is a way of making tracks, and loads of DJs use it. Loads of DJ producers, I should say, use it. Play them out. People love them. What's wrong with that? Although back in the past, when people originally started using samples, you would be going through your old record collections, finding tracks that you liked, finding things that could potentially be a sample. Now, of course, they're given to you as a sample, but finding that little snippet and then doing something creative with it, I think is creative. Although back in the day, sampling, it's robbing people's records. It's not creative. It's cheating. I think now these days we'd all agree that early hip-hop will be considered the height of creativity, taking something, putting a new spin on it and generating something completely different. But at the time, not so much. Lots of people will consider that to be just stealing other people's records, stealing other people's ideas, and making money off the back of other people's genius. So how many samples can you use in a track, and what you have to do with them in order to be considered a creative spin on something, and something that's generated yourself rather than just copying other tracks? DJ Shadow's Introduction album from 1996 is generally considered to be the first album made entirely of samples, but I don't think anyone would say that's not an original composition. But some back in the day, back at the same time, people would perhaps think were a bit of a rip-off. Something like Groove Jet by Spiller. It's got 3 great samples that they chopped up, put a beat over it, and created something different, but really heavily based on the original material. And at the time, I remember thinking, well, feeling a little bit cheated when I realized it was a sample, but then still thinking it was a bit of a work of genius because they'd done it so well. Something like the Bucketheads, The Bomb, same thing. I didn't realize that whole thing was essentially a sample with some beats thrown over the top until I was listening to the Chicago album and I heard the original track, and there it was. So naively, I thought Bucketheads had got a brass section into the studio. I was really impressed by it. Not so impressed how they wrote it now, but still impressed by what they did with what they had. And the list goes on and on, obviously. If you've never taken a look at whosampled.com, do take a look at it, because you'll realize how many tracks are based on old samples. And of course, once you start looking into it, there are samples everywhere. And if you dig into it, there'll be loads of tracks you didn't realize were samples, and loads of really creative uses of samples, using them as texture, as a sonic snippet, or putting loads together to create something completely new. And Daft Punk were obviously absolute masters of this. But some people would still consider it cheating. Make your own sounds, make your own textures, make your own snare drums, make everything yourself, and then it's your input, not using other people's. I don't think there are many people that would say using samples is cheating these days. They might be a shortcut, but I think they're now generally a valid creative choice, especially as the people that did write the tracks and do own the publishing and do own the mechanical rights do get a chunk of the profits from that. And then we come to sequencers and arpeggiators. Originally, there was definitely skeptics about the use of sequencers. They're not musicians, they're not playing their instruments, they're just programming them, and they don't sound like, something human or musical. They're too rigid, too quantized, too on the beat. Ironically, now we actually quantize live drummers to get them bang on the beat, and we've got sequencers that we've got humanization algorithms for to make them sound a little bit more human. But I don't think anyone these days would say a sequencer was cheating. Interestingly, even Bob Moog himself said, "We certainly didn't design the instrument with the idea that a guy with no musical training would use it. We always hoped and planned it would be used by decent musicians." And that brings me to generative sequencers and arpeggiators, where you put some notes in and then the algorithms start deciding what's going to be played. You've no idea half the time what's actually being played, and it can create new patterns, it can create new melodies. Something like the Oxy One, for example, you can ask it to create a melody based on a few input parameters, and you can just press try again, randomize, generate, or whatever it is, until you find something you like. Again, you've become a curator. You didn't write that musical line, but you know it's going to work. Is that cheating? Isn't it cheating? Same with arpeggiators. You think you can just press a few notes down and they can do all sorts of weird and wonderful things. They can, you can go up, you can go down, you can go up and down, but some of them will play different style of patterns depending on what you're playing, and then go to generative mode as well. It's the sort of thing that classical composers used to do. You've got a series of notes and do quite interesting things with them. But as a synth player or as an electronic musician, you've no idea what note's coming out of it. You know when it sounds good, but you don't know exactly what it's doing. So you're not actually writing those notes. You're just picking the best ones. Is that just like running through a load of loops in Splice or finding the perfect snare? Someone's already done it and I'm selecting which I prefer. It's a la carte composition. And I've just demoed something called the Qubit Bloom. It's a little Eurorack module. It's a sequencer. You put in the original sequence and then off it goes and does all sorts of marvelous things. And it does these amazing ambient compositions. I say compositions, that's doing all the sort of heavy lifting on something that's just sort of playing different notes and sounding absolutely beautiful. I've told it what to do up to a certain extent, but a lot of it is all down to the algorithms, all down to the programmers. I don't actually know what note it's playing. I just know it sounds nice. And that's a whole art form in itself. Modular synthesis, regenerative patches, things playing themselves from the parameters that you've put in. Someone like Richard Devine, for example, get all these amazing sounding sort of random little clicks and blips and really amazing sonic textures. He hasn't programmed what the notes are going to be. He's just programmed the parameters within which they play. I say just, what he does is absolutely fabulous, but some people may not think of him as a musician, more of like a computer programmer selecting the best algorithms to get the best result. What is the best result? Is that result musical, or is it just sort of weird noises? I think it's musical. It does what music's meant to do. It brings out emotions in you, whether they're good or bad emotions, but it's definitely there that sits at a certain level of creativity. Other people, as I say, might not agree. Other people may think it's just choosing the best random output. Is that creative? Well, I think so. It is in that case. Maybe the future of music isn't about who plays the notes, but who decides which selection of notes to pick. And that brings us to the latest creative tools, and that's AI. So there's loads of different AI tools out there for singing or for just creating whole tracks. And there's a whole bunch of moral issues around that in itself. But is using AI creative? Is putting a vocal into something that you've sung the vocal, you've created the melody, you've created the lyrics, you've sang it, and then it comes back to you with something that you can use in your track. Have you been created, or have you just taken a job off a singer? I know from the past experience that finding a singer is sometimes really difficult, and people sitting in the bedrooms can't find a singer, can't get the track to sound the way they want to get it to sound. They've got the creative impulse to do that. They've created a track with AI. Is that cheating? I'm not so sure, because if you got a singer in, you would still tell them what to sing. I have demoed this one. I was thinking about using it to show a singer what I wanted them to sing. And the people that we use to create the voices were paid to do that. So it's not like it's using artists from the ether. So at least that takes away that moral haze of what's it being trained on. But then if you go to a studio and you work with a DJ, I'm telling you now, they'll pull out a record and they'll say, do something sounds a bit like this, do something that sounds a bit like that. It happens all the time. So they're taking a record that's out there, something someone else has created, put it on, listen to it. I want a bass line a bit like that. So how's that different to something like an AI? And I'm just throwing the questions out here, by the way. I'm not saying AI is the best thing ever. I'm not saying I agree with it, but there are sort of moral implications. Other people see it as just a tool. Try and get it to create something. If that's useful, I've picked that random thing out. I've curated that bit of music like someone might do out of an arpeggiator or whatever. And I thought that will work and I will use that bit. How's that different to listening to a record saying, create something a bit like that? You've got the producer in the studio creating something a bit like that. Are they cheating when they do that? Because it happens, again, all over the place. And I know I'm getting myself in trouble just saying this, but it is a question. I've been in studios lots of times producing a track and something's been put on and say, do something a bit like that. It just happens. Stock, Aitken and Waterman were famous for it. They intentionally recreated or emulated the sound of US import club tracks, not simply by copying, but by dissecting and rebuilding. They took the same, make something a bit like this approach, and I hated them at the time. Not exactly the height of creativity to my mind, at least, but 13 UK number ones and over 100 top 40 hits, not to be sniffed at. And I'm only singling them out because they were so successful. But even Stock, Aitken and Waterman brought their own thing to the table, creating a new pop-tastic genre. Whether you were a fan of it or not, it was something new they'd added to the pool. AI, on the other hand, just drains it without adding anything of its own. They've literally listened to everything out there and then they squish it together. And I have done a video, a previous video about this sort of stuff, looking at how they do that and is it any good anyway? No, it's really not that good, but it's good at some things. And I think we can all agree that training on existing work without giving people credit, even though that's what people have done for years, there's a disconnect with it being automated. Human creativity is simply feeding the machine. And big tech draining the life out of people's creations, it really does become something out of a dystopian nightmare. Our imaginations feeding some autonomous, intangible data set. We become the commodity that's being mined. There are potentially ways it could work and be fair. What if you had a system whereby musicians uploaded ideas to their persona and you picked a certain persona and the AI created something that's learned from your siloed data? So for example, Nile Rodgers could upload loads of guitar licks and you said, I want a guitar like Nile Rodgers. It creates something based on what he's uploaded. He gets the dividend for his part being used. All those Splice and all those others must use some sort of system like that whereby the musicians are actually getting paid. In that case, it's not a sample that you're downloading, it's an idea. And in theory, that seems okay morally, at least to me, just like any of these sample libraries. And creatively, is that any worse than clicking through 100 samples until you find one that fits? I know it's not what people are doing with AI now, but it could be how it works in the future once we're out of this wild west. Or will everything I say here sound completely outdated in a couple of years? Will we be like Queen, not using synths and then embracing them in a few years' time? Only time will tell, I suppose. You know, we could sound like Luddites that just aren't embracing inevitable technical change. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope I didn't annoy too many people talking about AI again, and I hope nobody's imagining me vigorously pleasuring myself again. You know, these are discussions that need to be had. We need to challenge ourselves and think about these things and not just shout no. If there's something there, it's an inevitable technical change. How do we make that work for us? So hopefully a couple of ideas there. Perhaps. And if you did enjoy it, please do subscribe, ring the bell, join me over on Patreon, do all that sort of stuff. Check out my starskycarr.com website as well. There's patches, the samples, the stuff to download. It's always nice when people buy some of the even smaller sample packs because every little bit does really help to support the channel. Anyway, thanks for staying to the very end and I will see you next time.